Hello, everyone. Good afternoon to some of you and good morning to others. So this webinar will cover the data analytics tool. And so because it's 2 o'clock Eastern right now, let's just go ahead and get started as we have a lot to cover. And so the data analytics tool is a comprehensive system for creating on-the-fly filters, exports, dashboards, mail merges. The data can be used to create, to send out emails, build reports, and it supports advanced database concepts with left joins, logical conditions, aliasing, aggregates, pivots, predefined reports, and it has flexible security access. So today we'll cover the basics of building finance student billing and some AP queries. So we'll build a AP query and we'll also build some finance student billing queries. And because finance is quite vast and it has so many different parts to it that include the general ledger, budgeting, inventory, accounts receivable, accounts payable, and much more, I decided to focus on just two aspects of it today. And when I refer to student billing, what I mean is running queries based off of customers, their invoices, and their receipts, because most of the time that's what clients are looking to bill. They're trying to find all the families, what invoices are due, when they're due, what everybody has purchased, what invoices came from the contract, what invoices came from the cafeteria module, or after school or extended day, and so forth. So the purpose of student billing queries would be to kind of get started on how to build queries that include invoices and receipts. And then on the AP side, accounts payable side, we'll build parallel queries. So we'll do vendors and vendor invoices and vendor payments. After this webinar, if you have any comments, any feedback, any suggestions for a future webinar, feel free to email us at support@pcreducator.com. We'll gather that information and then we'll plan our next webinar. So let's get started with the query. So first, whenever you're building any sort of data analytics DAT queries, there are a few things to keep in mind. First question you have to ask yourself is, what information am I looking to extract? So that's an easy question to answer, because anytime you're building a query, you have that in mind. Okay, I'm trying to build a query to find my customers and their invoices, or I'm trying to build a statement or something like that. So that question you would already know the answer to. The second question is a little bit more difficult. So the second question is, where is that information stored? So my goal in this webinar is to provide you with some of the more common tables so that next time it'll be easier for you to find where some information is stored. And then the third question, or the third item to consider, is how would you plan a workflow and what tables would you pick to kind of connect everything together when you're building your query. So that's also a bit tricky, and to kind of deal with that, I've created some diagrams that I'll show you in a second. All right, so let me zoom in a little bit so that people can clearly see my screen. And I'll go ahead and show the first diagram that I have, and that's the finance AR diagram, accounts receivable diagram. We're going to post several diagrams after the webinar, so they'll include accounts receivable, they'll include accounts payable. We also have one for budgets and a couple other things. In this one, since I'm covering student billing and AP side a little bit, I'll go over the most common tables that you would use to build those kinds of queries. So the first table that I want to talk about is the customers table. Customers table will have very basic information about a customer. So a customer would be On the finance side, we call them customers, but on the admin side, they're called households because our database is fully integrated. They're the same records, they have the same ID, but in the customers table, you see more sort of a finance type of information, and in the households table, you'll see more general information such as address and phone numbers and emails and things like that. So customers table would include information such as the customer balance, it would include the customer ID, total invoice amount, and so forth. And I've covered the household table in more details in the previous webinars. So the next table that is really common to use is called customer invoices. Customer invoices table has basic information about an invoice. So that would include the invoice issue date, the invoice total amount. It would also include when that invoice is due next. So let me pull up an invoice so I can kind of show you what information would be contained in the customer invoices table. So I have, I'm on the Finance AR invoices screen, and I'll just look at the first invoice. I'll go to details. So this part here, the customer information, the person, which is the student, the issue date, the payment term, the memo, these are all part of the customer invoice table. Then if I pull up my diagram again, another really common table is the customer invoice items table. That gives you more information about each invoice. So if I pull up my invoice again, so at the top I have basic invoice information, but under this heading invoice items, this tells me specific information about the invoice, the items that are purchased, what accounts are tied to, and how much each item costs. So 11-12 grade tuition costs $29,500, and this person has a class fee and financial aid. So this information you would pull from the customer invoice items table. And then in terms of the product, it'll give you the product ID. But if you wanted more information about the product, such as the product name, you would use the products table. So if I pull up my diagram again, you can see that customer invoices connects to customer invoice items, which then connects to products. So products would tell you specific items that were invoiced to the customer. Another more common table is the customer invoice schedule table. So what this table provides us is that it lets us know when each invoice is due and what date they're due and how much is due. So for example, if I open up my invoice again and if I click on schedule on the left-hand side, it tells me that this invoice is due on 7/15, then 8/15, then 9/15, and so forth, because this invoice is on a 10-month tuition plan. So that table, the customer invoice schedule table, will provide us with this information, the due date and the due amount information. So if you wanted to run a query to find out the list of all invoices and then when they're due, this would be a great table to use for that purpose, and we'll actually build a query based on that table in a little bit. So let me go back to my tables again. Another common table is the customer invoice receipts table. What happens is that whenever let's say that a family has 5 invoices. Let's say that they have 5 children and each student has an invoice, and they use one check or one payment to pay all of those 5 invoices. What the customer invoice receipts table tells us is that how much of a receipt is allocated to pay a certain invoice. So if you have one check that pays 5 invoices, or if it even pays partially those 5 invoices, this table would tell me how much of the invoice was paid through a specific receipt. So we'll be looking at this table shortly as we actually create a query. And then the customer receipts table, this would tell us more information about the receipt. So for example, if I go to my list of receipts, so I'm under Finance AR Receipts, and if I just look at the first receipt, this information here, the receipt date, the receipt amount, the name on receipt, the reference number, the method, and so forth, that information would all be pulled from the customer receipts table. So these are the most common tables that you'll use when you are pulling student billing information from the data analytics tool. Now let me pull up my second diagram. This is more geared towards the AP side, and we'll post this as well after the webinar. So just like customers, we have the vendors table that would have vendor-specific information such as the total invoice amount for the vendor, the total balance that a vendor has, and so forth. And then the households would be the same table that we looked at earlier. This is where you can get information about the vendor's address, their phone number, things like that. And just like we have the customer invoices table, we also have the vendor invoices table that has the basic information about the vendor invoice. So if I go to Finance AP Invoices, and I'll pick this second one here. So vendor invoice table will give me the information that you see towards the top, the receipt date, the due date, the memo, what account is being paid to. And then similar to customer invoice items, we also have a vendor invoice items table, which is here. And that would give us this more details about the invoice, such as what was actually purchased, how many items were purchased, the quantity, the amount for each individual item. And just like in the customer AR side, we have product ID, and then we connect that to the actual products table. We would do the same thing on the AP side, that the vendor invoice items table would then connect to the products table so that we can actually get more information about what is actually purchased from a vendor. So these tables are very much in parallel, whether you're in the accounts receivable side or the accounts payable side. They're just named differently, but they have similar information. So now we have the most common tables. So I talked about vendor invoices. I talked about vendor invoice items and products. Then just like we have customer invoice receipts, we also have the vendor invoice payments table. So let's say that you purchase 10 things from a vendor. So let's say that you have 10 different invoices for one vendor, and you use one check to pay all 10 invoices. And maybe you paid them all in full, or if you paid them partially. This table would tell you how much of the check was paid towards each of the invoices, each of the 10 invoices. So that's again in parallel with the customer invoice receipts table. And then that links to the vendor payments table. So if I go to AP payments, so if I go to AP payments, and if I pull up one payment from the list, all this information, the payment date, the payment total amount, name on payment, this is all pulled from the vendor payments table, just like how we have the customer receipts table on the AR side. So these are all the most common tables. And now let's actually go ahead and build some queries. So the first query that I'm going to build is I want list of all customers, and I want to see all of their contract invoices. The reason I'm picking contract invoices is because we have most schools that use contracts, but the same concept could really be applied to lunch invoices or after school invoices or extended day invoices or anything else. But in this example, I'll use contracts, and I'll also point out where you would adjust your query to run it for some other sort of invoices. So let's go ahead and I'll go to DAT and I'll click New. So the first query, as I said, I want customer information and I want the invoices that each customer has. And I want those invoices to be specifically for the 1920 contract. So I don't even know where to begin right now. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up my diagram. So I see that my diagram has customers here, and I know that this table has basic customer information. And I also see the household diagram, the households table, and I know that this table has basic household information such as the address. So I'm going to go ahead and start with customers and link that to households, and then I'll come back to my diagram. So I'll go ahead and open up my finance group. And then I'll select the customers table here. As I was saying, that the customer table would have very specific information for finance side. So like there's invoice balance, invoice paid amount. So that takes like all the invoices into account. But for our query, we're going to separate, we're going to show each individual invoice so that we can see how many total invoice came from the contract and what was actually purchased by the families. So from this table, I'll get the customer name and maybe the customer ID. If I wanted, I could get more information, but I'll just get this two fields for now. And then I'll go ahead and click Save. And then I'll click the plus sign on the customers table. And then I can connect it to the households table just like how we saw in our diagram. So in the households table, I can actually get more information. I want the address, I want the city, I want the email, I want the zip and the state. And then I can also get specific information for each contact within that family. So parent names and parent phone numbers and things like that, that would all be included in this table. So I've selected the address and I have the customer name from the earlier table, so I'll go ahead and click Save. Whenever I add tables and fields, I just click Results to run the report to make sure that I'm actually getting data. Because sometimes what happens is that you may work on a report for so long, and then at the end you figure out that you missed something or you made a mistake early on and it may not produce any results. So what I try to do is every time I add a table, I run my report by clicking Results on the left to make sure that each step of the way I'm getting some sort of results, and I confirm that, okay, these are the results that I should be getting. So I'm getting customer name, their addresses, and their ID. So that's all I've included so far. So the next thing that I want to include is their invoice information. So if I go back to my diagram, it tells me that household table connects to the customer invoices table. So then I go back to my query on the left. And then I click the plus sign on the households table. And then here I have many different tables. So one of the tables that is available is the customer invoices table. So I have the customer invoices table, and then here I can get some of the some information from here. So one thing I like to get is the customer memo, and I'll show you what the reason that I included this. And I like to get the issue date when this was issued. I also like to see the payment term. So payment term would tell me what each invoice is tied to, whether it is on a monthly plan or annual plan or two payments per year or anything else. This due date and this due amount is basically the next due date and the next due amount of each invoice. So you could include it if that's what you're looking for. But eventually what I'm looking for is all like the full schedule of each invoice. So if an invoice has a 10-month plan, that I want to see all 10 due dates and due amounts. So that's why I'm not going to include this for now. But if you needed to, you could check these off as well. Then another thing that you may want to consider is the first name and the last name. That's basically the name of the student that's tied to an invoice. So first name, last name, grade level, that's for the student that's tied to the invoice. If a student is not tied to the invoice, because it is possible that some invoices may be connected to families or customers only and not be connected to students, in that case, these fields would just be blank. But if you wanted to see the names of the students, you can select those, which is why I'll select them. I think that's all. No, I'm also going to check off is paid off. I want to see which invoices have already been paid off. Maybe I also want to know which invoices are past due. So I'll keep these items and then I'll go ahead and click Save. And then I'll click Results to make sure that my report produces some sort of data. So I see that that this family has 3 different invoices, and then it tells me the memo of each invoice. Another thing that I want to include in any of my my reports are the IDs, because that makes if I include a customer invoice ID, that makes each record unique, because sometimes what happens is that the same family may have the same invoice multiple times. So a family may have the same invoice twice. And if I want to see the invoice separately, I can include the customer invoice ID, because that would make sure that each invoice is considered as a unique invoice. Because sometimes you may invoice a family twice, maybe if they have a couple of kids, and it may be the same exact amount. So an invoice ID would differentiate that invoice for each child. So I'll go ahead and pick this and click Save. And then I'll click Results to kind of see what I have so far. So I don't really like the way that my report looks right now, because the times, the date and the time says like 12 a.m. The customer invoice ID is all the way to the right. First name is here, last name is here. So I'm going to fix all of these things, but at least I know that I'm getting results in my report. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to reorder my columns to make this look a little bit better. So to reorder columns, you just go to Column Order on the left, and you just grab it and move it up and down. So keep in mind, this doesn't sort the data. It's just moving the columns around. So maybe I want to start by ID, customer name, address, city, and then I'll say state, then I'll say zip. Then I'll say first name, last name is paid off, past due. I think I'll move the issue date up here. I'll move the payment term up here, customer ID somewhere up here. So I can just move these up and down and then click Save or click Next. So now the order seems a little bit better. I have my customer name, the address, the memo, the ID, and then information about each invoice, what payment term. If it is tied to a student, then it'll show me the student name. Is paid off, 1 means that it is paid off, 1 means true, and 0 means false. So it's or these invoices are not past due, but this one is. So that's what that means. All right, so then what I need to do next is, because I have all these invoices like from 2013 and 2014 and so forth. So first, what I want to do is I'd like to make my date look a little bit better. I don't like this time thing, 12 a.m. for all of them. So if I go to Fields, there's a display format for the date, and I can come here and then I can specify whichever format I would like. So I'll just pick this one and save. One other thing that I forgot was to show the total invoice amount. So if I go back to my query and if I click customer invoices, there's a field called total, and that'll show me the total invoice amount. So I'll save that. I'll go to my column order and then I'll put that here somewhere, maybe after the issue date. So now my date looks much better, but I don't like how the total looks. There's no dollar sign in front of it. So I want the format to look better than what it does right now. So if I go back to my fields, I can see the display format for my amount as well, and I can pick one of these. So I'm just going to pick the dollar sign and click Save. And then I can click Results to run my report again. So anytime if you want to run your report, you can just click Results. So now this looks a little bit better. This can kind of be confusing because it says first name and last name, but it doesn't tell me is this the first name and last name of the customer or of the student. So if I want to relabel any of these fields, I can simply go to Fields, and I can relabel any of these fields. So instead of saying first name, I'll say student first name to make things more clear. And then I'll say student last name to make things more clear. And this is the same place that you can do your sorting. So if I wanted to sort by the issue date, I can just grab it and move that up all the way. And I can also pick ascending or descending sort order. So I'm going to sort by the issue date, and then let's say by the customer name. And then I can go ahead and save it and click Results. So now the oldest invoice is dated on 7/1/2012. But at least now my data looks a little bit better. It shows the student first name, student last name, whether something is paid or if it's past due, and so forth. So now I want to restrict my query to only pull data for contracts for 1920 year. What I do is I go to Query, and whenever contracts are generated and the invoices are generated through the contracts, we use the customer memo to indicate what contracts they came from. So typically the memo says something like contract 1920 or something along those lines. And similarly, if an invoice is generated from the cafeteria module, it'll say cafeteria in the customer memo. And similarly, if it's generated from like after school or extended day activities, it'll have the word extended day or after school in it. So when you're looking for specific invoices, what you can do is you can pull up the customer invoices table by clicking on it. And then there's a condition section where you can specify the condition. So because I know that all of my contract invoices have the word contract 1920, so let me just pull up one of them. So it has this description in the memo, and this automatically was generated from my contract, so I didn't have to manually put this in. So it says contract 2019-2020. So what I do is I go back to my query and I say customer memo equals, and I can search for contract 2019-20. Now, if I wanted cafeteria, I could search for cafeteria. If I wanted after school, after school care or after school, I could search for those invoices. I can also do multi-select. So if I wanted different kinds of invoices, if I wanted after school, and if I also wanted contracts in one report, I can also do that. I can do multi-select as well. I can do contains, and there are many different options that you have available to find certain kinds of invoices. So in this case, I'll just say contract 2019-2020. So I put in the condition and then I click add. And now I have this condition for my query. And then I can click save, and then I can click results. So now this will only pull information for my contract 1920 invoices. So I can see, okay, I can see my family information, I can see the student's name, I can see the total amount, I can see the payment term. But what I don't see is what is actually purchased. Did they just have tuition that was purchased? What about any sort of class fees? What about any financial aid? So as I was saying, that information is in the customer invoice items table. So if I want to see that information, I would include I would include that table. So if I go back to my diagram, it says customer invoice connects to customer invoice items, which connects to products, and products would actually have the name of the items that was purchased. So if I go back to my query, I click plus on customer invoices, and I get the customer invoice items table. And this has information like the price, quantity times price and overridden price are pretty much the same thing, so you can just pick one or the other. And this will tell us price for each individual item that was purchased. Quantity, I don't really include that for my AR reports because typically everything is like one item. But if I was doing my AP reports, then I might have different quantities for different things. So for this report, I'll just pick overridden price and click save. And then if I click the plus on the invoice items, then I can connect that to the products table. And now I can actually get the product name. So if I pick the product name and click save, and then I run my report, now I can see that this family, the total amount was $19,575, and it included the 11-12 tuition, the class fee, and then there was financial aid of $10,000. So again, let me organize it a little bit. So I go to column. I'll show the product name first and the price. And then I'll go to fields and I'll change the display format to show the dollar amount. And I'll change the overridden price to just say, let's just say amount. And click save and results. So now it tells me that financial aid was 10,000, parenthesis means that it's negative, $75 for the class fee, and 29,500 for 11-12 tuition. And then if I wanted to actually make the higher amount show up first, I could go to my fields and I could grab the overridden price and move that to the maybe like right under the overridden or maybe right under the customer name. And let me do that in descending order. So it'll sort it by issue date ascending, then by customer name in alphabetical order ascending, and then overridden price in descending order. And then let me go ahead and click save. All right, so now you can kind of see what happens. So now it still sorts it by the issue date, and then it shows the higher amount at the top, and then second is class fee, and then the third is financial aid. So this is what you can do to kind of see the individual items that were purchased through the contract, or if this was a cafeteria report, it would show me each item that was purchased. Or if it was a summer school report, it would show me what class was purchased or what the product name was for the class and so forth. So this is how you would create a report that gives you invoice information and it gives you specific item that was purchased. So the next thing I want to do is I want to go over how do you see the due dates of each invoice. So what I'm looking for is I want the invoice information and then the payment term and then the actual due dates of each invoice. So I don't really care about the product information for my next report, so I'll get rid of that. and instead I'll include the customer invoice schedule table. So if I go to query, and instead of having the customer invoice items, because that would tell me individual items, I can just get rid of this table. So I click on it and delete, and it deletes that table and everything underneath it. And if I run the report, now I'm back to just my invoice without the details of what was purchased. But I want to see the individual due dates of each invoice, what day is due and what amount is due. So if I go back to my AR, I see that customer invoice is linked to customer invoice schedule table. So if I come to my query, I click here, plus on the customer invoices, and I pick customer invoice schedule. Now I can pick the due date, due amount. And even before I run the report, I'll just fix up my display format to say the $, and then this format for the date. And I'll go to column order, and I'll show the due date first and then the due amount. So I have all of this information, then I have payment term, then I have the student information, then I have the paid, is past due, and then I have the due date and the due amount. So now this tells me that 10-month payment term, and then for each invoice it tells me how much is due and when is due. So this is the same invoice. You can see based on the customer invoice ID is the same invoice, and it tells me when each amount is due. So you can kind of get more details on the due date for each invoice. Now let's say that you're only looking for invoices that are due within a certain period of time. If I go back to my query, and in the customer invoice schedule table, I can put a condition to find out. Let's say that I want to know all the invoices that are due in the month of August. What I can say is I can say a due date, and I can say something like range, and I can say 8/1/2019 to 8/31/2019 and click add. So I'm putting a condition greater than equal to 8/1, less than equal to 8/31, and I'll make it a parameter. I'll show you what that is used for. So I'm going to go ahead and click save, and then I'll run my query. And let me go ahead and click results. So now these are all the invoices that are due on a particular month. So these are all due on 8/15 because it fits within my range here. And if you make a condition, a parameter condition, that means that you can come here and later change the date. So if I wanted to then see, let's say September 1st to the end of September, so September 30th, I can override it and click apply new parameter, and then it would produce the list of invoices that are due in September. So if I apply new parameter, the page will refresh, and then I'll be able to see all the invoices that are due in the month of September. So you can use parameters for this purpose. That way you can easily update the conditions on your report, especially if you're running monthly reports or weekly reports or anything like that. You can come and update the dates and quickly see the new information in your query. So that's how you would use a customer invoice schedule table. The next thing I want to go over is the receipts information. So I'm going to go to my query again, And for this one, I'll get rid of the customer invoice schedule table because we kind of went over what that is used for. So I'll go ahead and delete that. So now I want to find these. So I have all of these invoices. I want to find how much of these invoices are already paid off. Like how out of these invoices, how many have payments associated with it, receipts associated with it. So I have 27 invoices right now. And if I want to see how much of each invoice was paid, I'm going to go ahead and pull up my diagram. And so customer invoice table connects to customer invoice receipts, which connects to customer receipts. So I'll click plus here, and then I'll go ahead and click customer invoice receipts. Again, this amount would tell me how much of the receipt paid a certain invoice. So as I was saying, if you have a parent that uses one payment to pay several invoices, this amount would tell you how much of each invoice was paid. So I'll go ahead and include this. And then I'll click the plus sign on the customer invoice receipts and get the receipts information. This will tell me more information about the receipt date, the receipt memo, the receipt method, and other information that you may need. So I'll just grab these few items and then click Save. And again, I'll just organize this a little bit, put in the display format to be certain type. And then I'll go ahead and organize my columns. So I'll say receipt date, receipt amount, receipt method, and receipt memo. Or maybe I'll move the memo here somewhere. Okay. And then amount can be kind of ambiguous. So I'll go ahead and say I'm going to come to the amount and say something like allocated amount or paid amount or something like that. This basically tells me how much of the receipt pays off the invoice. So I'll go ahead and click Save and click Results. So now these are all the invoices that are paid that have a payment associated with it. And this tells me that for this invoice, 2,957 is paid via check. Same with this one. Then for this invoice, 2,950 is paid via credit card. This one is paid via e-check and so forth. So you'll notice that now I only have 9 results because this is only including the invoices that have at least one receipt. If I wanted to see all 27 invoices and then if they do have a payment, if I wanted to see how much it was paid, all I have to do is if I go to Query, and I covered this in one of the previous webinars, but if you go to one of the tables like the customer invoice receipts tables, and if you say with or without, then it'll also show you anything that doesn't have a receipt. So if I run my report again, now I see all 27 again. And if they have a receipt, it'll show me the receipt information. If they don't have a receipt, it'll just be blank. So that's how you can run a query to find something that has a connection. And if they don't have a connection, you can use a with or without condition so that it shows you blank fields if they don't have any data. So these were the queries that I wanted to go over for the accounts receivable side. Now let me go ahead and quickly go to the accounts payable side because basically what I covered here would mostly apply to accounts payable side. The only difference would be the names of the table. So instead of customer invoice, it would be vendor invoice. Instead of customer invoice receipts, it would be vendor invoice payments and so forth. So I'm going to go ahead and go to DAT. I'll click New Report here, New. And then this time I'll go ahead and get started with Finance Vendors table. This would be like Customers table, and you have details about the vendor, like how much was paid to them this year, what their total balance is, and things like that. So here I'll just grab the vendor ID and the vendor name, click Save, click Results to make sure that my report produces results. and then I'll go back to my query, click the plus sign, and I'm going a little bit fast because I went through the AR side slowly and I only have 15 minutes. So vendors would connect to households, and then I can get the same kind of information that I did earlier: address, city, state, zip, maybe email too somewhere. So there's email. So I'll get some of these fields. And then from there, I can get vendor invoices. Vendor invoices. So I'm just following my diagram right now. So I'm going from vendors to households. Now I'm on vendor invoices. Then I'll go to vendor invoice items, and then I'll go to products. So vendor invoice would tell me if something is paid off, if something is past due, when the due date is, when the due amount is, the receive date, and so forth. So I can get some of the basic information from here. I also want to get the total. This would be the total amount for my vendor invoice. I'll click Save. Then just like I had connected customer invoices to customer invoice items, I'll connect vendor invoice to vendor invoice items. I'll get the overridden price, and here I will include the quantity because typically when you are purchasing from vendors, you don't purchase just one item. You typically purchase more than one item. So I'll include the quantity here too. And then just like I had connected customer invoice items to products, I'll connect vendor invoice items to products, and I'll get the product name. So now I have all this information. Now let me organize my columns a little bit. So I'll have vendor ID, vendor name, address, city, state, zip, email. Then I'll have due date, due amount, is paid off, is past due, receive date, the total amount, the price for the individual item that was purchased, the quantity, and the name of the product. So I'll move the product name here. And then I'll go to my fields and I'll update the display format so that it looks nicer. And then save this. And then I'll say total. I'll call it total amount. And then overridden price would be the price for each individual item that was purchased. So I'll call this one item amount so that I know the distinction between the two. And then I'll save it, and then I'll click results. So now this tells me a list of my vendors, gives me their address information, their email, and then it tells me the invoice information. So the total amount for this one is $488. That's kind of expensive. So 10 bookmarks were purchased in this one, and then there was also a book purchase, 100 books purchased, and then I have these other note cards and so forth. So this tells me all the vendor invoice information, and then it tells me the individual products that were purchased, how much of each product that was purchased, and the individual amount for each product. So this, and then I have the total amount. So for the quantity I have here, then I have the item amount, and then I can reorganize my report to display whatever information I would like. And then I also show is paid off if I've already paid it off, or past due if something is past due. So the next thing I would do is, let's say I want to find out the payments that were made against all of these invoices. What I do is I go to my query. I'll get rid of the items now because now I just want to see the total amount, the total invoice amount, and then how much it was paid off, like if there are any payments against those invoices. So I'm going to delete this table, and I'll click plus on the vendor invoices table. And I can see vendor invoices connects to vendor invoice payments, which connects to vendor payments. So I'll link that to vendor invoice payments. And this amount, again, would be the allocated amount. So I'll go ahead and check amount. And then from here, I'll go ahead and pick vendor payments. And this would tell me more about the payment. So the name on the payment, the address information on the payment, it would tell me the memo, when it was created, and other information. So I'll go ahead and pick a few things here. Payment date, and then I'll click Save. And then I'll go to my fields, and I can update the display format, save it. I can go to column orders. I can organize my query. So I'll say name on the payment, payment date, payment amount, payment memo. And now this tells me the payment information that is associated with all the vendor invoices. And again, this only shows me all the invoices that at least have one payment. So if I wanted to see all the invoices that, if they don't have a payment, if I just wanted to show blank columns, then I can change this to with or without. And I covered that in more detail in a previous webinar. So I'll select with or without and then click results. So now if an invoice doesn't have a payment, it'll show blank information for my payment in my payment columns. And if they do have a payment, it'll show when the payment was made and how much of that payment was made. So I basically kind of did a parallel report to what I did earlier for the AR side. And the final thing I want to cover is if I go to DAT, there are some standard reports under PCR imported, and all of the finance-related reports start with bracket finance in front of it. So if there are some standard reports that you would like us to add, just email us at support@pcreducator.com, and we'll deploy it to all the schools if there's some with standard reports. One of the reports that I typically use is called the Customer Balance Details Report. So if you were to run this report, this will tell you the name of each customer, and then it'll tell you the balance separated by invoice and by receipt. So for example, Benfield family has a total invoice balance of $50, and they have a total receipt amount of $10. So their total balance would be $40. And you can, of course, adjust the report to exclude the account name and the transaction type. And when you exclude that, then it'll just sum up the total. So instead of separating it by 50 and 10, it'll just sum it up for you. So it'll show you $40 as the customer balance. And then you can go to query. And any standard reports that we have, you can take those and customize them. So if I wanted to add address information, I could just pull up my diagram and I can see, okay, customers ties to households. So I could click plus on the customers table, link it to household, and get the address information for these customers. I can also click the customer balance details table, and I can put in specific conditions like the from and to date, and it'll show me the balance within my begin and end date. And I can also include unposted items. By default, the report only shows posted items. So if I wanted, I could also include posted items. And if I wanted to run it for a specific ledger, so by default, it runs for the general ledger. But if I wanted to run it for my online store or my summer ledger or my cafeteria ledger, I could see the balance for each particular ledger for the same family. So these are some of the parameters that you can play with in some of these custom queries that we have already created for you. So that is all I wanted to cover today. And again, if you have any suggestions, any feedbacks, anything for the future webinar that we should cover, please email us at support@pcreducator.com. And even though I covered a lot, that was just a surface of what the finance tables are and what all the information they contain. There's so many other things that I haven't even touched, like budgeting and deposits and payment configuration and product inventory and all of that. But that's something that we would look to cover in one of the future webinars. So I want to thank you for joining me today, and this recording will be posted on our website in the next couple of days with the diagrams. And I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you.